So now we come back from foreign lands, and the theater of war is Vancouver's notorious downtown east side. A policeman, Kim Rossmo, a graduate in mathematics and criminology, begins to detect a pattern of crimes and tries to bring that to the attention of his superiors. Once again, an important warning falls on deaf ears. Kim Rossmo.
This conference is about ideas, and the main idea I'm going to start off with, and I'll introduce a few others as time goes on, the main one I'm going to start off with is an idea that came to me during my PhD research at Simon Fraser University. If we could have the first slide up. That's the development of geographic profiling, which is a method to determine where serial killers most likely lived. It came out of research that was in a field called environmental criminology. Okay. Investigative process is fairly straightforward if two people who are intimates or acquaintances attack each other. But when we have a series of criminals out there called predators. They hunt strangers. These are sexual molesters, serial killers, serial rapists. They're very dangerous because our traditional investigative methods don't work. There's no association between who they attack and their relationship with them because they're strangers. So our ability to find these people, to arrest them, is limited. The average length of hunting activity of a serial killer is something like 7 years. So they pose an incredible challenge to policing, and they pose other challenges to our whole social order. If you've ever seen the movie Casablanca, there's the famous line at the end, after Humphrey Bogart has shot Colonel Strasse of the German SS, and Captain Renault turns to his gendarmes and he says, "Colonel Strasse has been shot. Round up the usual suspects." But there's an even better line at the beginning of the movie, when Colonel Strasse first arrives in Casablanca. And he asks Captain Renault what's happening with the investigation of 2 murdered German couriers. So he looks at the colonel and with a straight face says, "Because of the serious nature of this crime, we're rounding up twice the usual number of suspects." Well, we've advanced a lot in criminal investigations since the 1940s. We have ways of prioritizing suspects, of managing information. I spent a number of years as a patrol officer in Vancouver. Several of those years were in the Skid Row area, about 8 years. When I was a rookie, my field trainer and I got a call for an assault in a hotel on the edge of the Skid Row area. And I'm diligently recording all the facts in my notebook. And I get to the point of the interview where I ask the victim what the suspect looked like. He looked at me and he says, "Constable, I can do better than give you a description. I've drawn you a composite sketch of the man." I looked up at my field trainer because they hadn't told me in the police academy that victims did their own composite sketches. He just shrugged his shoulders, so I said, "Well, I'd very much like to see that, sir." So the elderly gentleman walked across the room and he pulled open the drawer of his dresser and he took out a piece of paper. He handed it to me, and what he'd drawn on the piece of paper was this. We told him if we saw anybody that looked like that, we'd be sure and stop and talk to them. The point of the story is that's information, but it's not information of value. And geographic profiling is about information. If any of you followed the Beltway sniper case, you saw all sorts of information that was problematic for the police. The white van that morphed, or the white box truck that morphed into the white van. If you remember the Paul Bernardo case here in Ontario, the Camaro Firebird that they were looking for that actually was a Nissan. And of course, when we talk about the case of the missing women in the pig farm, information, management of information, analysis of information plays a critical role there. Really, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to translate data into information, information into knowledge, and then we base actions on that knowledge. If we base actions on data or information, we have a problem. And we're going to make mistakes, we're going to be ineffective. One way of defining geographic profiling, as I started off, is a way of determining where the offender most likely lives. It can also be, though, defined as an information management strategy, a way of sorting through the hundreds or thousands of tips that come to the attention of the police in a large criminal investigation. Again, referring to Bernardo, in just 9 months, the Green Ribbon Task Force had collected 31,000 tips and had 3,200 suspects. In the Green River case in Seattle, involving 49 prostitute murders, they had 18,000 suspect names on their database about a decade ago, and had only had the resources to check out about 2/3 of those. So we need to manage that information. We live in a world of information, but just like any sort of static or noise, we want to decrease that, and we want to increase what is important and knowledgeable and help us commit the best and most efficient and effective actions from a police, from an intelligence, even from a military perspective. Now, here's something the media might refer to as a random murder. It was a stranger-on-stranger crime. We have trouble understanding what motivated the offender, but it's not random. It's not random in the mathematical sense. One of the things we find is that criminal offenders hunt in very specific ways. And if we can understand that, if we can decode that pattern, we can use that information to help us focus a criminal investigation. I'm going to show you just a couple of slides of some of the very basic, simple theories that underline geographic profiling, and then we'll move on from there. One is that, similar to shopping patterns, actually similar to how animals hunt and forage in the wild, criminals are influenced by distance and other spatial features of their environment. So, while none of us are probably going to go to a corner store 7 miles away when we can get our bread at one that's just at the corner, maybe a block or two away, and while animals are not going to hunt any further than they have to, because it expends energy, they lose water, they're more likely not to survive, we see the same thing with criminals. Criminals commit their crimes within 1 or 2 miles of where they live. However, if you get too close to a criminal's home, they're less likely to commit an offense because they have a desire for anonymity. So we can describe a probabilistic relationship between where a crime occurs and where an offender lives. And it's something called a distance decay function. It just means that as distance increases, the probability drops. Now, another piece of theory that's important, and this really is probably the most important idea related to geographic profiling. This was a model that was developed by my supervisors at Simon Fraser University, Professors Paul and Patricia Branningham. And I'm not going to do justice to their theory, but they said that if we want to understand where crime happens, we take a look at where an offender lives, works, and plays, and the travel routes and connections between those sites. Where that intersects suitable target areas, that's where crimes happen. So note, if I can figure out the laser here, there's no crimes around this criminal's work site because there's no targets there. And there's no crimes in those target areas because he's not familiar with them. Okay, so like I said, it's a gross oversimplification. The goal of my research, the idea I guess I had, was to try to invert this model. Rather than figure out where crimes will happen, the question was, if we know where the crimes have happened, what can we say about where an offender is most likely based? Courtesy of some graphics from a recent issue of Popular Science, I'll show you the basic mathematics that goes behind this. Here's a series of crimes. It's actually a series of rapes in Lafayette, Louisiana, and we'll talk about this case in a few minutes. But the little balls or dots show you the locations of the crimes. There were 14 in this particular series. We take that distance probability function I just showed you a moment ago, and we overlay it around one of the crimes. And we repeat that for all the different crimes, and these probabilities begin to combine, so we have some locations on the map that are higher, or colored in the red, than the others. In the end, we can overlay suspects on this, and we can prioritize them by where they sit on that probability function. Now, we are talking probability. You know, if this was a Hollywood movie, then it would be an exact science, but that's not the case. But as you heard before, if you've ever gambled or bought a lottery ticket, you know that probability is a very powerful entity, especially if you do something enough times. And we start dealing with serial criminals, we have a lot of locations, and we can get pretty good results. Here's one of the very first cases that we applied it to. I'll just use it as an example. It's a serial arsonist in a suburb of Victoria, British Columbia. For some reason, this gentleman would dress up as a ninja warrior, go out at nighttime on a bicycle or on foot, and he would set arsons to homes, to schools, to businesses. So the red dots here show you his arsons. The greenhouse shows you where he lived with his parents. And what we do is we enter each of these coordinates into a computer system, and that produces for us what we call a jeopardy surface, or our probability surface. Now, we can't do much with that. So the first thing we would do is imagine we were flying over top, looking straight down. So it's like a topographic map. We bin everything into 20 colors, and then we integrate it with the street map. We can work with this because we can prioritize tips, suspects, addresses, intersections by where they sit on that color scale. Geographic profiling does not give you an X that marks the spot. What it does give you is an optimal search strategy. Some of the strategies or tactics that have been used over the time are allocating patrol and surveillance resources, searching through police record databases, of which they have many, using sex offender registries, which are very popular in the United States and are now being introduced into Canada, looking at other agencies that have information, mental health, social services, even private businesses. Bloodings or DNA screens. I'll show you an example of that from a case in Mississauga, right here in the Toronto area. There was a series of 11 teenage victims attacked on the street in 1998. The last victim was raped, so as a consequence, the police had DNA. They also had 312 suspects, which, if you were DNA them all, would cost upwards of close to $100,000. So the investigators prioritized the 312 using a number of factors, one of which was the geographic profile. List of some of your suspects from the computer database, the suspects mapped out in the area of Mississauga where the crimes are occurring, an overlay of the geographic profile. You can see how now we can start to prioritize the suspects by where they sit on that map. The individual that has been convicted of this crime was 6 out of the 312. His house was there. So there were 5 individuals scored higher, and there were 306 that scored lower. So that put him in the top 2%. Now, you can't solve a crime with any profiling technique, psychological or geographic. What you can do is you can manage your information more efficiently, more effectively, and get to your solution, whether it's physical evidence, a confession, or an eyewitness, a lot quicker. Other strategies, examining, we actually are serious when we say these offenders hunt. And we break the hunt down into a search for and then attack on a victim. And we have a typology of hunting methods, which actually matches very closely a typology that George Schaller developed for how lions hunt in the Serengeti Plains. And one of the things we want to know, are offenders stalking victims from some central point, or are they prowling around at nighttime looking in windows? We may want to see if there's some overlap in the victim's routine activities. In one case, the police were able to determine that several victims, rape victims, had all gone to the same car dealership, spoken to the same car salesman who they'd given their details to. So they were able to solve that case by finding the commonality in the movement patterns of the victims prior to the crime. Canvases in urban areas, searches in rural areas, obvious. Fugitive tracking. This might be where we know who we're looking for, we just don't know where they're living or where they're staying. What we might have is sightings, wiretap information that will give us a telephone or a cell phone switch site where calls are made from, maybe purchases. The important thing in geographic profiling is a location. It doesn't have to be a crime, it just has to be a location. So as a consequence, we've been able to profile cases where there's been one rape, but the victim's credit card was used at numerous locations. Or kidnappings where offenders have used cell phones, and we know the cell phone switch site that the call was placed from. Mail-outs by postal code. If we do a general broadcast on a major crime, sometimes the police will get thousands and thousands of tips coming in. I mentioned the 3,200 suspects in the Paul Bernardo case. Well, 3,198 of them were wrong. So sometimes we get more efficient, effective information by doing mail-outs, by prioritizing postal or zip codes, just like a private business will do. This gets a better response from the public and gets a smaller amount of information that's higher quality. You can also translate these things into other languages if you're dealing with communities where English is not the first language. Department of Motor Vehicle computer searches, same thing. If you have partial information, you can develop it further. One of the ideas or the themes I'm stressing here is how we can use information and build upon that. I think it's very important. In one child murder case, the last victim was taken out of her backyard while she was playing with a 4-year-old friend. All the 4-year-old friend could say was that the man was driving, I'll use the example, red sedan. Well, that's not much to go on, but if you do a Department of Motor Vehicle search, and this was a city of about 2/3 you look at all vehicles that are coded as sedans, all sedans that are red, and all red sedans that are in the peak area of the geographic profile. And in this particular case, there were only about 65 vehicles that matched all 3 of those parameters. So it can serve as a useful winnowing tool. Okay, this is the Lafayette Southside Rapist case. It's one that's got a lot of media attention. It was the example shown in the popular science graphics a couple of minutes ago. From 1984 to 1995, on the south side of Lafayette, they experienced 14 rapes. They didn't connect the rapes until 1995. Connecting crimes to serial criminals is something that the police are still weak at. If we've got physical evidence, that's great. Behaviorally, it's much more problematic. If you ever saw the movie or read the book Silence of the Lambs, you have this black witch moth chrysalis stuck in the throats of the various victims, the Buffalo Bill, the serial killer. That just doesn't happen in real life. We're more likely to get something like prostitute strangled, dumped to the side of the road, no physical evidence involved. And of course, linking crimes is an issue in the downtown East Side missing women case. Anyways, they do connect the crimes finally in 1995. This was a burglar rapist, pretty vicious, covered a range of different neighborhoods, everything from projects to the mayor's neighborhood, apartments to houses. They form a task force, but the rapes stop. They carry on for another year. The task force is eventually disbanded, and eventually it's down to a single detective. In 1998, he asked for a geographic profile. One of the things he told us was that he noticed many of the victims had been to the same superstore, and he was wondering if the offender had followed them home. We actually discounted that when we visited the crime sites. Here are some of the crime sites. Pretty much every one of them, I could take about 2 or 3 steps from a sidewalk and be looking in a window. That suggested someone prowling around at nighttime. And in the next slide, I'll show you the inside of one of the victims' homes, which you can see by looking in the window. If you look at these, tell me who lives here, or maybe more to the point, who doesn't live here. A single woman, no man, no child. Offenders are very good at reading environmental cues. One guy said he targeted a place with cats that told him it was a woman. Another person said he would not attack anything with a boat in the driveway. One guy even analyzed the oil stain patterns. So your house, your structure gives off all sorts of cues, and some predators are very good at reading those. Anyways, we did our profile. Here's the results. There were about 2,000 tips in this case, about 1,000 suspects. Eventually a tip came in, anonymous tip. The offender lived there, but Detective Gallion decided that really the profile was based on where the offender was living at the time of the crimes. So we dug into the individual's personnel files, and that's where he lived. That was really good. And that was an old residence. He put surveillance on the individual who smoked. They recovered a discarded cigarette butt, which they submitted to the lab. And in January '99, they got a positive match, and they made their arrest. The person responsible for the crimes was a police sergeant in the surrounding sheriff's parish. And that's why the crimes had shut down when the task force was formed. I'm about out of time, but if I could have one more minute, I'll just make the example of the missing women case. Again, this is about information. There was no smoking gun. There was no homicide. What we did have was in the little green area a small cluster in time and space. These are missing women who were not found. If you can see from the years 1983 to 1994, we only had 0, 1, or 2 per year. And then we began to get a statistically significant cluster. Missing people don't stay missing very long. About 90% are found after 3 weeks. Any explanation, in my report I said, any explanation has to explain these particular questions. Why no bodies? Why women, not men? Why not other Canadian skid roads? Why now and not before? And the only explanation that could account for that was a serial killer. Unfortunately, that was not a popular opinion. So really what we're saying here is that we want to go beyond just the facts. Oops. We can analyze those facts because those facts have a lot of information. We have the science to do that. What we want to avoid are the bureaucracy, the tyranny of bureaucracies. We want to recognize that the law is only one element of the whole process. There's a lot that science, criminology, and analytic tools can help us. And my last point is, what is humanity's biggest threat? Well, humanity's biggest threat is humanity, whether it's crime, civil unrest, war, environmental damage, or even the diseases that we ourselves are creating. And it's up to us if we want to make the changes, create the organizations, maybe even create a world policing system, which unfortunately the UN is not at this time, that can protect us. Thank you. Thank you.